Welcome to this program in the Our Finger Lakes History series. I am Seneca County historian Walter Gable. This program deals with Glenn Hammond Curtiss, who was born in Hammondsport, New York, at the south end of Keuka Lake, here in the Finger Lakes region. Curtiss became famous in his 52 years of life. Famous as a pioneer in the motorcycling industry and as an architect of American aviation. He was also, late in his life, very important in the development of trailers for tourism and for the development of communities in southeastern Florida. We can justly claim him as one of the most important persons to have been born here in the Finger Lakes. To put it simply, Glenn Hammond Curtiss made many notable accomplishments in his lifetime. Many of those accomplishments are for his aviation work, but he made accomplishments in other fields, as I will show in this program. Here you see a picture of the village of Hammondsport about 1900. Hammondsport, located on the southern end of Keuka Lake, had approximately 1,000 people when Glenn Hammond Curtiss was born May 21st, 1878. You can see in this picture the many vineyards that were near the village. Shipping, grape growing, and winemaking were the main businesses of the town. In the foreground of this picture is Kingsley Flats, the flat area that would become the main flying field in Hammondsport. Glenn Hammond Curtiss, born here May 21st, 1878, in the Methodist parsonage in Hammondsport, New York. Born there because his paternal grandfather, Claudius, was the pastor of the Methodist Church in Hammondsport starting in 1876. Glenn's parents were Lua Andrews Curtiss and Frank Richmond Curtiss. Frank was a harness maker. The larger house in the foreground, just slightly right of center at the bottom, was the Curtiss residence. It was known as Castle Hill. The house was large enough for two families. The house was purchased by Glenn's grandfather so that Glenn's parents would have a place to live and for it to be a residence for Glenn's grandparents when the grandfather was ready to retire from the ministry. It was Glenn's mother, Lua, who decided on the name for our Glenn Curtiss. For a middle name, Lua chose Hammond to pay tribute to Lazarus Hammond, who was the founder of the village. For a first name, Lua chose to name her son after the beautiful local gorge or glen she so enjoyed. However, Lua added an extra N at the end of the first name so as to give her son a unique version of the word Glenn. Imagine what she might have done if the times had allowed her to give her son any last name rather than the last name of the father. But Glenn had a special attachment to his paternal grandmother, Ruth Bramble Curtiss. His grandma was much more responsible for his upbringing than was Glenn's mother, Lua. Grandma Curtiss became a widow shortly after her husband retired from the ministry. She continued to oversee the operation of the small vineyard that was part of the property. Grandma Curtiss was always reading to young Glenn. One of the favorite readings that Grandma read to young Glenn was Darius Green and His Flying Machine. It was a long poem written in 1869 by John Trowbridge. I have included some excerpts from the poem here in red because there have been some speculation that there were significant similarities between Darius Green and Glenn Curtiss. As you watch this program, I want you to see for yourself if you think there really are such similarities, although they have to be coincidental. Shown here is an 1892 picture of Glenn with his younger sister, Rutha. Glenn was only 4 when his father and his grandfather both died the same year. At the age of 6, Rutha became deaf from an attack of meningitis. With the support of the residents of the small community of Hammondsport, young Glenn grew up rather well. Glenn became known as a careful planner who could dismantle and fix anything mechanical. Glenn completed formal education only through the 8th grade. This is a picture of Glenn's mother, Lua Andrews Curtiss. Glenn and his mother did not enjoy the most positive relationship. Lua moved to Rochester when Glenn was 11 years old, so that Rutha could attend the school for the deaf there in Rochester. She was too young to board at the school, so Lua got them an apartment. Glenn stayed back in Hammondsport with his grandma, so that he could complete the last 3 grades to finish his formal education at grade 8. After completing the 8th grade, Glenn went to Rochester to live with his mother Lua. Glenn was hired to work at the Eastman Company, stenciling film cases. He devised a stencil machine that increased stenciling capability tenfold, and it was adopted by the plant. Glenn later built a rudimentary camera to study photography. Glenn will be an amateur photographer the rest of his life. Glenn, however, wanted to be outdoors, so he became a bicycle messenger boy for the Rochester office of Western Union, delivering telegrams. With his friend Ward Fisher, the two also took long bicycle rides. Glenn won many bicycle races at county fairs. Glenn's sister finally became old enough to board at her school for the deaf in Rochester. So then Lua married an old beau named J. Charles Adams. Charles owned a vineyard in Rock Stream between Dundee and Watkins Glen. The new family moved there, including Glenn, but Glenn did not enjoy working in the vineyard. So soon Glenn moved back to Hammondsport to live with his beloved grandma. In his visits back to Hammondsport to see his grandma, Glenn Curtiss developed a close lifetime friendship with Tank Waters, who was the #1 wheelman bicycler in Hammondsport at the time. But Tank Waters soon realized that Glenn was an even better bicycler. Tank Waters later manufactured the Erie motorcycle. Tank and Glenn were partners in the Marvel line of motorcycles. Look at the facial expression in this photo, and you will see a bicycler who was a focused, determined racer. Glenn Curtiss was the star racer in a bicycle group sponsored by Hammondsport druggist Jim Smelly. Smelly had a side business of selling and servicing bicycles. Smelly sponsored a group of young men racing bicycles, and Curtiss was the star racer of the group. Glenn Curtiss became interested in a young lady who also loved to ride bicycles and also to hike, like Glenn himself. Glenn Curtiss was determined to marry Lena Pearl Neff. So he lied about his age and said he was 21. This enabled Glenn not to have to seek the permission of his mother for him to marry, a permission he knew that she would not give. In fact, Glenn's mother will try to break up this marriage. As a newly married man, Glenn needed a full-time job rather than making some income from bicycle racing and some income from other small part-time work, such as photography. And the Hammondsport people provided him such a start. Druggist Jim Smelly offered Glenn to take over Smelly's growing bicycle repair and spare parts business. Local businesswoman Melinda Bennett lent him a storefront on Hammondsport's Pulteney Square, in which Glenn opened his bicycle shop. Glenn also made use of the remaining inventory of harnesses left from his dad's business. In June 1901, Jim Smelly turned over his bicycle repair and spare parts business entirely to Glenn. More specifically, Glenn bought out Jim Smelly's sales agencies. Glenn soon opened seasonal branch offices in both nearby Bath and Corning, and he started making his own bicycles. Lena gave birth to a son, Carlton, in 1901, but he was a blue baby and died a month before his first birthday. Glenn Curtiss was one of the first residents of Hammondsport to go to the Pan American Exposition being held in Buffalo in 1901 from May to November. At this exposition, Glenn saw the Thomas Auto-Bi, as it was called, the first practical motorcycle in the United States. As a bicycle racer, you should be able to realize how fascinated Glenn must have been with the idea of what became known as motorcycles. Glenn ordered parts from the E.R. Thomas Company, but the parts, when they came, needed to be machine polished. Glenn set to work on making his own motorcycle engine. I need to add, however, that in December 1902, Glenn Curtiss was the first person in Hammondsport to own an automobile. He had accepted it in trade for a Hercules motorcycle. Glenn obtained the license for the sale of many different makes of automobiles, names of automobiles not long in operation in the auto industry. Glenn was making motorcycles in his bicycle shop. Wife Lena had taken on the bookkeeping work for Glenn's expanding business. Shown here is his early Hercules motorcycle. Notice that unlike the Thomas Autobuy, Glenn had located the engine just above where bicycle pedals would have been located. Note also that power goes to the wheel via a belt driven to the rear wheel. In 1904, Glenn built a separate building for motorcycle construction. Prior to the new building, Glenn had disposed of his harness business to make room for the manufacture of motorcycles. Glenn Curtiss was constantly making improvements to his motorcycles. Shown here is the 1909 Curtiss motorcycle. Note, now it is a chain drive. This is a picture of Glenn Curtiss with that motorcycle, the world's first V-twin motorcycle. He was a determined motorcycle racer. The Curtiss Manufacturing Company was making motorcycles in Hammondsport. Glenn himself was constantly making improvements. Glenn was also racing motorcycles, setting many world records. In May 1903, he was the first person to race a motorcycle 1 mile in less than a minute. In January 1907, he set a world speed record of 136 miles per hour, and he was dubbed the fastest man on earth. If Glenn didn't have enough business with motorcycles and bicycles, both racing them and manufacturing them, he also got involved in the aviation business, first by supplying motors to power dirigibles. Shown here is a 1904 picture of Thomas Baldwin's dirigible called the California Arrow. It was the first successful dirigible in the United States. It was powered by a Curtiss 9-horsepower V-twin motorcycle engine. When the 1907 earthquake in San Francisco destroyed Baldwin's plant there, Baldwin came to Hammondsport and actually lived in the Curtiss home. By this time, there were many factory buildings nearby the Curtiss home. The Curtiss Manufacturing Company was making bicycles, motorcycles, engines for these as well as for dirigibles. Baldwin had his work going on. By 1906, Glenn had helped his good friend Tank Waters set up to make his brand of motorcycles in Hammondsport. Business was so booming that Curtiss uprooted some of the vineyard to build another machine shop. It was inevitable that Glenn Curtiss, the great bicycler and motorcycle racist, was going to have to become an aviator when he got the chance. He made his first flight in June 1907 in a Baldwin dirigible. And of course, he had to be the pilot. I need to add here that it was the Wright brothers who conducted the first powered flight December 17, 1903. The Wright brothers, like Glenn Curtiss, had started in bicycles and motorcycles and then turned to powered air flight. The Wright brothers conducted their work generally in as much secrecy as they could have. This is so different from the way Glenn Curtiss operated. Alexander Bell, the inventor of the telephone, was the key person in the formation of the Aerial Experiment Association, of which Curtiss was a founding partner. Much of their aviation development work was done in Hammondsport. March 12, 1908, Casey Baldwin made the first Western Hemisphere flight outside of the Wright brothers' camp, taking off on frozen Keuka Lake. The flight was 318 feet 11 inches, making it the longest first flight yet accomplished by a heavier-than-air craft. Unlike the secretive Wright brothers' flights, a crowd had gathered for the occasion. There on the ice, much of the town watched from a distance. After some repairs, the Red Wing flew again on the ice for St. Patrick's Day, but the crowd witnessed the first airplane crash. On May 18, 1908, a somewhat refined aircraft called the White Wing flew 279 feet before a large crowd. Note that it has tricycle landing gear. This was the first aircraft in the United States to have ailerons, triangular flaps at the wingtips for stability. The tail section had been salvaged from the Red Wing. With still more refinements to the first two aerodomes, the Red Wing and the White Wing, came Aerodome number 3, which was known as the June Bug. With the June 1908 successful flights of this refined aircraft, the Aerial Experiment Association and Glenn Curtiss were ready to compete in the Scientific American Cup race of the Aero Club of America. On July 4th, 1908, hundreds of spectators came to see a public flight of this June Bug in the Pleasant Valley area of Hammondsport. In this flight, Curtiss covered almost 1 full mile before the engine overheated. Following these 1908 accomplishments, Glenn Curtiss continued to make advances in aviation. When the AEA agreement ended, Glenn decided to pursue outside the AEA. Curtiss first joined with Augustus Herring, but soon formed his own airplane manufacturing business. Shown here at the top is a refined airplane called the Gold Bug. One refinement it had from the June Bug was that the wings fabric was rubberized. Curtiss was making airplanes there in Hammondsport. In 1909 and 1910, Curtiss was busy with his aviation work. He employed a number of demonstrated pilots. He engaged himself in aerial competitions and demonstrations. In August 1909, Glenn took part in the Grand Sommet d'Aviation aviation meeting in Reims, France. The Aeronautical Society wouldn't let Glenn use the Golden Flyer, so Curtiss built a modified version that was slightly smaller. Without time to even give it test flights, Curtiss took apart this slightly smaller version and transported it to France in 4 crates. While preparing for the race for the Gordon Bennett Trophy, the Wright brothers filed their lawsuit against the Herring Curtiss Company, the Aeronautical Society, and the Glenn Curtiss himself personally for copyright infringement. It appears that the Wright brothers purposely chose to file the lawsuit at this time. I'll say more about this shortly. Curtiss hadn't named this plane, but it became known as the Reims Racer. His triumphs at the Reims events led to the French proclaiming Curtiss as the greatest aviator in the world, and they awarded him French pilot's license number 2 because pilot license number 1 of France had already been awarded. These successes were good for Hammond Curtiss's aviation business back in Hammondsport. Curtiss went on to race an event in Italy. After his month abroad, Curtiss returned to Hammondsport after grossing $15,000 in winnings, turning himself into a world figure and putting the Curtiss airplane firmly on the European map. As he arrived back in Hammondsport, he was greeted by a huge contingent of local residents. Glenn Curtiss continued in several aviation competitions, usually but not always winning. A famous competition was for the flight between New York City and Albany. A person could fly either direction. The winner would receive the Scientific American Trophy for that year, and also $10,000 from the New York World newspaper. It was a rather treacherous flight route, largely because of likely changing weather conditions. But Curtiss, as he usually did, studied carefully and cautiously. As he's flying from Albany to New York City and as he's flying over West Point, the military academy cadets went wild, saying later how simple it would be to have been bombed by air with such a plane. Reaching New York City, Curtiss circled the Statue of Liberty as ships in harbor sounded sirens, whistles, and anything else that would make noise. At noon, Curtiss landed on Governor's Island. Another form of aviation experimentation that Curtiss engaged in at the Hammondsport area was the idea of using airplanes to drop bombs. Curtiss was a visionary. He saw the potential of aircraft in warfare. Perhaps the newspaper comments of the West Point cadets, as Curtiss had passed over them, helped to contribute to Curtiss's pursuit of convincing the Navy of its aerial options. Adding to this was the fact that the Wright brothers already had sold an airplane to the U.S. Army. At top left, you see how Curtiss constructed a crude makeshift flight deck on the U.S. cruiser Birmingham in Norfolk, Virginia harbor, revved the engine on his Hudson Flyer aircraft, and barely got it airborne. But it was the first airplane launched from aboard a ship. In winter 1910-11, Curtiss established an operation at San Diego, California. This provided him a base for operating on open water year-round, as well as a place to provide training for naval officers to be aviators. At top right is shown Curtiss becoming airborne with his tractor seaplane. At bottom right, you see a close-up of a plane equipped for water landings and takeoffs. In these pictures from the 1912 Curtiss Manufacturing Company catalog, you can see the development of Curtiss aircraft in just 3 years' time. Truly remarkable. On June 8, 1911, Curtiss received U.S. Pilot's License number 1 from the Aero Club of America. He received license number 1 because the first batch of such licenses were issued in alphabetical order. Wilbur Wright received license number 5. The fictional character Tom Swift in that series of novels was said to have been inspired at least partially by Glenn Curtiss. The books are set in a small town on a lake in upstate New York. The first book in the series was called Tom Swift and His Motorcycle. The third book in the series was Tom Swift and His Airship. Many people received training in flying aircraft from Curtiss and his associates. Here you see the first or second female to fly an airplane. Her name is Blanche Scott, and she received her training from Curtiss. The Curtiss manufacturing operations grew up near the Curtiss family residence in the center foreground. Besides this expanded plant operation in Hammondsport, there was also an even larger new plant operation in Buffalo. Before the United States formally entered World War I, Glenn Curtiss was providing aircraft to the British and then developing training aircraft for the U.S. Army and Navy. Civilian and military aircraft demand so boomed that the Curtiss plant in Buffalo employed 18,000 workers. The Hammondsport plant employed 3,000. As I had indicated in an earlier frame, in August 1909, the Wright brothers filed a copyright violation lawsuit against Curtiss personally and some businesses he was associated with. The lawsuit wasn't resolved until during World War I. The U.S. government at that time was desperately short of combat aircraft and pressured both sides to resolve their dispute. Eventually, the Wright brothers will win all 12 of their lawsuits. In 1917, Glenn Curtiss opened the Curtiss Engineering Corporation on Long Island. Curtiss himself moved there to work during the war, but top management remained at the Buffalo plant. It was here at this Long Island facility that Curtiss did his research and development work for the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy wanted an airplane that could fly across the Atlantic Ocean, so Navy officials asked Curtiss if this could be done. Curtiss replied, "Of course it can." In 1917, he was commissioned by the U.S. Navy to design a long-range flying boat. He designed a long-range 4-engine flying boat for the U.S. Navy. It became known as the Curtiss NC, and it could hold a crew of 5. Unfortunately, the NC was not placed in service until after the war ended. At the end of World War I came the end of contracts with the U.S. Navy. In September 1920, the Curtiss Aeroplane and Motor Company underwent a financial reorganization. Glenn Curtiss cashed out his stock in the company for $32 million, and he retired to Florida. The Curtiss family moved to South Florida and developed an area that became known as Hialeah. This was at the time of the Florida land boom. Shown at top right is a picture of Glenn Curtiss on the beach, but he was not done being active. Shown at the bottom are 2 pictures of the Curtiss mansion he had built. In partnership with James Bright, Curtiss was active in real estate development in the greater Miami area. Shown here is an ad for lots in a new community they named Brighton, but became known as Hialeah because of what local Seminoles said. Curtiss and Bright were astounded that they sold $1 million worth of lots in just 10 days. Curtiss was on the front page of Time magazine for its October 13th, 1924 issue. He hadn't rested on his fame as a motorcycle racer and builder and as an aviator and builder of airplanes. In Florida, he was busy in real estate development. But he also went on hunting trips in the Everglades. I mention because these camping trips got him thinking. What Curtiss came up with on those camping trips hunting in the Everglades was to make improvements to the then existing travel trailers. Shown here is the resulting Curtiss Aero Car. These Curtiss Aero Cars were luxury trailers built to suit the individual buyer's wishes. They were built for a variety of uses, including campers, buses, traveling showrooms, offices, and even a zoo on wheels. By the mid-1930s, these Curtiss Aero Cars were selling for an average of $5,000, and they were being produced until 1942. In July 1930, Glenn Curtiss traveled to Rochester, New York, to contest a lawsuit brought by former business partner Augustus Herring. While there, Curtiss suffered an attack of appendicitis. He died in Buffalo on July 23, 1930, from complications from an appendectomy. His funeral service was held in Hammondsport, New York, at the St. James Episcopal Church. Curtiss was buried in the family plot at Pleasant Valley Cemetery in Hammondsport. As to the legacy of Glenn Hammond Curtiss, I have listed here some of the honors paid to him, most posthumously. Glenn Curtiss was more than just the fastest man on earth. Of course, his many accomplishments are displayed at the wonderful Glenn Curtiss Museum in Hammondsport. If you haven't been there, you must go. At the entrance to the Glenn Curtiss Museum, you see this aircraft and his comment. This quote suggests just how inspired Glenn Curtiss was by flying. The altitude, the rushing wind, the sense of something long awaited, now realized, sets a sensation of flight apart from any other. I hope you have enjoyed learning more about Glenn Curtiss and his many interests and accomplishments. His story is so much a part of our Finger Lakes history.